Imagine a woman who secretly passed information to one of the most powerful intelligence services in the world for almost 40 years, and yet lived her entire life without spending a single day in prison. She was never arrested, never put on trial, and never forced into hiding. When the truth finally became public, she was already an elderly woman living quietly in a normal suburb of London. She walked through the same streets as everyone else, spoke with neighbors, and did her grocery shopping at local stores like any other retiree. To anyone who saw her, she looked like a completely ordinary person who had lived a long and peaceful life. But behind that calm and ordinary appearance was a story that sounds more like the plot of a spy thriller than real life. This is the story of Melita Norwood, a woman many historians consider one of the most successful Soviet spies ever to operate inside Britain. Her story is remarkable not only because she managed to stay hidden for so long, but also because even after her identity was revealed, she was never brought to court. For decades, her name never appeared in newspapers, intelligence reports, or major spy scandals. She was not a famous politician, she did not hold an important government position, and she did not look like someone who might be involved in international espionage. To everyone around her, she was simply an office worker, quiet, polite, and completely unremarkable. Every day she went to work, completed her tasks, talked with colleagues, and then returned home to the normal routines of everyday life. Her neighbors saw her as a typical middle-aged woman who blended easily into the neighborhood. Nothing about her seemed unusual. In fact, that ordinary lifestyle became the perfect cover. In the history of intelligence operations, the most effective agents are often the ones nobody ever suspects, people who look so normal that the idea of them being spies never even crosses anyone's mind. But everything began to change toward the end of the 20th century. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, many classified intelligence documents slowly started to become known to researchers and historians. Archives that had been locked away for decades began revealing details about secret operations and hidden networks of informants. Inside those files were reports, coded communications, and the names of individuals who had secretly worked with Soviet intelligence outside the USSR. As these documents were examined, stories that had been hidden for generations started to come to light. Among them was the story of a woman who had quietly passed valuable scientific information from Britain to Moscow for many years. When researchers first saw her name in those archival documents, they did not immediately realize how important the discovery was. But as they continued studying the files, it became clear that this person had been providing the Soviet Union with valuable information related to scientific and industrial research for decades. For journalists and historians, the discovery was shocking. They realized that someone who had helped Soviet intelligence for nearly 40 years had been living an entirely normal life in Britain the whole time, working at her job, interacting with colleagues, and living among people who had absolutely no idea about her secret activities. The story sounded so unbelievable that at first, some people even thought it might be exaggerated or misunderstood. When the information eventually reached the public, people began asking the same question again and again. How was it possible that someone who had passed secret information to a foreign power for so many years had never been exposed earlier? Why had British intelligence services which spent decades trying to uncover Soviet agents during the Cold War, never managed to stop her. After all, that period was one of intense global tension. Intelligence agencies from both sides were constantly trying to identify spies, protect state secrets, and gather information about their rivals. Yet in the middle of this hidden struggle, there had been someone who remained almost completely invisible for decades. Even more surprising was what happened after her identity became public. Many people expected that the British government would immediately open a criminal investigation and bring her to trial. But that never happened. By the time her story became known, she was already in her 80s. Most of the events connected to her activities had taken place many decades earlier. Authorities eventually decided that putting an elderly woman on trial would serve little practical purpose. As a result, one of the longest-serving Soviet spies in Britain never faced a courtroom. To understand why this story is so extraordinary, it is important to remember the atmosphere of the time in which these events took place. The Cold War was a period of deep tension between the East and the West. The Soviet Union and the Western Alliance competed for influence around the world, and their rivalry was not limited to politics or military power. Intelligence gathering played a huge role. Secret information could shift the balance of power, accelerate scientific development, or give one side a strategic advantage over the other. Because of that, both sides invested enormous resources in espionage. Intelligence agencies relied on networks of agents who worked quietly and patiently, sometimes for years, gathering pieces of information that could prove extremely valuable. That is what makes the story of Melita Norwood so fascinating. She was not a professional spy in the way we usually imagine one. She did not go through dramatic secret training programs. She did not carry high-tech spy gadgets. And she did not take part in dangerous undercover missions, like the ones we often see in movies. Instead, she lived what looked like a completely ordinary life and performed an ordinary job that seemed unrelated to intelligence work. But that ordinary life was exactly what allowed her to stay hidden for so long. The people around her saw nothing more than a quiet and modest woman who blended easily into everyday society. And because of that, almost no one ever suspected that behind that normal appearance was someone who had been quietly supplying information to one of the most powerful intelligence services in the world for nearly 4 decades. When the story of Melita Norwood became known to the public, the reaction was mixed and often intense. Newspapers quickly picked up the story, and within days, her name appeared on the front pages of major British publications. For many people, the revelation came as a complete shock. An elderly woman who had quietly lived among her neighbors for years suddenly turned out to be connected to one of the longest-running espionage stories of the Cold War. People struggled to understand how something like this could have happened, and how someone who had passed information to a foreign power could remain unnoticed for so many decades. Journalists began searching for any details about her past. They spoke with neighbors, former colleagues, and acquaintances, trying to understand what she had been like in everyday life. Almost everyone said the same thing. She always seemed calm, quiet, and completely ordinary. Many neighbors remembered seeing her walking around the neighborhood or talking with people outside her home, and none of them could imagine that this elderly woman had once been part of one of the most secret intelligence stories of the 20th century. That contrast between her normal life and her hidden past made the story even more surprising. Soon, debates began across British society. Some people were angry that someone who had passed information to the Soviet Union had never faced any punishment. To them, it seemed deeply unfair. Many argued that regardless of her age or how much time had passed, she should still have been brought to court. Newspapers published opinion pieces questioning whether the government's decision not to prosecute her was too lenient. For critics, the idea that such a long-running spy operation could end without a trial felt almost unbelievable. But others saw the situation differently. Some people pointed out that by the time her identity was revealed, Melita Norwood was already very elderly, and that the events connected to her activities had taken place decades earlier in a completely different political environment. To them, the case looked more like a historical episode of the Cold War than a modern crime requiring harsh punishment. Some even argued that her motivations seemed ideological rather than financial. According to this view, she may have genuinely believed she was helping maintain a balance of power during a dangerous period in world history. Historians and intelligence experts also began discussing the case in detail. Many of them said that the story of Melita Norwood illustrates how complex and hidden the intelligence battles of the Cold War really were. During that era, both sides were constantly trying to obtain information about each other's scientific and military developments. Sometimes these struggles became public and led to major spy scandals. But in many other cases, the activities of intelligence networks remained almost completely invisible to the public. For intelligence historians, her case became a clear example of how the most successful agents are often the least noticeable people. Unlike many famous spies who attracted attention through dramatic operations or extravagant lifestyles, she lived an extremely modest and quiet life. That simplicity helped her avoid suspicion for decades. She did not try to appear mysterious or secretive, and there were no obvious signs that she was living a double life. Instead, her greatest advantage was how ordinary she appeared to everyone around her. As time passed, public interest in the story continued to grow. Television programs, documentaries, and historical articles began examining her activities and her role during the Cold War in greater detail. Again and again, people returned to the same question. How could one of the longest intelligence operations in British history take place right in the middle of society, while almost no one noticed anything unusual? The mystery of that question fascinated both the public and experts alike. But perhaps the most surprising aspect of the story was the calm reaction of Melita Norwood herself. When journalists began asking her questions, she did not try to disappear or make dramatic statements. Instead, she responded calmly and without strong emotion, as if speaking about events that belonged to a distant past. There was no visible panic or fear in her responses. It sounded more like an elderly person reflecting on something that had happened many years earlier. And that calm attitude made the story even more intriguing. People were not looking at the dramatic image of a spy from movies, but at an ordinary elderly woman who lived a quiet life and spoke about her past with little drama. The contrast between the scale of the story and the simplicity of the person at its center made the entire case even more remarkable. The more people learned about it, the clearer it became that they were witnessing one of the most unusual and mysterious chapters of Cold War history. Over time, interest in this story began to spread far beyond the United Kingdom. Reports about Melita Norwood started appearing not only in British newspapers, but also in international publications. Historians, journalists, and Cold War researchers began closely examining her activities and trying to understand what real impact she might have had during her time. The question was not only how she managed to remain unnoticed for so many years, but also how important the information she passed along actually was. Many experts believe that one of the most significant aspects of her work was its connection to scientific research related to metals and industrial technologies. In the middle of the 20th century, this type of research played a major role in the development of new technologies. Scientific discoveries could influence not only industrial progress, but also military development. For that reason, intelligence agencies in different countries closely monitored scientific projects and tried to gain access to information about new research and technological advances. While working in a research organization, Norwood had access to technical reports and scientific documents describing various studies and developments. At first glance, these materials might have seemed like ordinary research papers, but to specialists, they could contain very valuable details. Even small pieces of information sometimes helped another country understand the direction in which technology was developing and what methods engineers and scientists were using. For Soviet intelligence, information like this could be extremely useful. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union was actively developing its own scientific and military programs. Any knowledge about technological progress in Western countries could potentially help speed up research or avoid certain mistakes. Because of that, even technical reports and scientific documents sometimes carried significant value. However, historians still debate how important the information provided by Norwood actually was. Some believe that the data she passed along may have played a meaningful role in certain Soviet scientific projects. Others argue that although the information was useful, it was not necessarily decisive in major technological developments. The truth likely lies somewhere between these two views. What remains clear is that her activities continued for many years, and that Soviet intelligence considered her a valuable source for a long period of time. Another question that researchers often discuss is how she managed to avoid suspicion for so long. In the mid-20th century, British security services were actively searching for possible espionage networks. After several high-profile cases involving Soviet agents, awareness of espionage became particularly strong. Despite this environment, Norwood continued her work and passed information for many years without attracting serious attention. Some experts believe the main reason was simply how unremarkable she appeared. She did not live a luxurious lifestyle. She did not display sudden wealth. And she did not behave in ways that might have raised suspicion among colleagues or neighbors. Her daily routine seemed completely normal. She went to work, performed her duties, and returned home. From the perspective of the people around her, she looked just like any other employee. In addition, intelligence operations are often built on patience and caution. An agent might pass information only occasionally, and only when it is safe to do so. Sometimes months or even years can pass between contacts. This careful approach makes such activities extremely difficult to detect. In Norwood's case, some historians believe that this quiet and patient strategy helped her keep her secret for so long. For this reason, her story continues to attract the attention of intelligence historians and researchers. It demonstrates that in the world of espionage, success is not always about advanced technology or dramatic missions. Sometimes the most important skill is simply the ability to remain unnoticed. An ordinary person, living an ordinary life, can sometimes become part of events that influence international politics and global history. And the more researchers study the archives and documents from that era, the clearer it becomes that the Cold War was filled with many similar, hidden stories. Most of them remain largely unknown to the public. But the story of Melita Norwood became an exception, a rare case in which the secret activities of one person eventually became known to the entire world decades later. The story of Melita Norwood gradually became one of the most unusual espionage stories of the Cold War. It was very different from the classic spy stories we often see in movies or read in books. There were no dramatic chases, no sudden arrests, and no dangerous undercover missions. Instead, everything happened quietly, in the background of ordinary everyday life. And that is exactly what makes this story so remarkable. It shows that sometimes the most important events in history happen quietly and remain hidden from the public for many years. When researchers began studying her activities in detail, it became clear that her story reflects a much larger picture of that era. The Cold War was not only a confrontation between armies and political systems, it was also a hidden battle between intelligence agencies, where information played an enormous role. Each side tried to learn as much as possible about the other's scientific research, technological progress, and strategic plans. In some cases, even small pieces of information could influence the balance of power or help accelerate important technological developments. But the story of Norwood is interesting not only from the perspective of intelligence history. It also raises an important question about the motivations of people who become involved in such events. Unlike many well-known spies who acted for money or personal gain, she claimed that her actions were driven by political beliefs. According to her own words, she believed she was helping maintain a balance of power in the world. She argued that if different countries had access to similar knowledge and technology, it could reduce the chances of a major global conflict. Of course, not everyone agrees with that perspective. For many people, passing secret information to another country remains a serious crime, regardless of the reasons behind it. Because of that, debates about her story continue even today. Some people see her as a traitor who betrayed her country, while others view her as an idealist who acted according to her own convictions during a tense period of world history. These different interpretations show just how complicated and controversial historical events can be. What remains undeniable, however, is that Melita Norwood lived a long life and was never brought to trial. She passed away in 2005 at the age of 93, decades after the events connected to her espionage activities had taken place. By that time, the world had changed dramatically. The Cold War had ended, the Soviet Union no longer existed, and many secrets from that era had slowly begun to surface. Today, her story serves as a reminder of how complex and layered that period of history really was. Behind the major political events and international crises were thousands of smaller stories that most people never knew about. Intelligence operations often took place quietly, hidden from the public, and sometimes even from the people living nearby. The story of Melita Norwood shows that some of the most fascinating chapters of history involve the most ordinary people. She was not a general, a politician, or a famous intelligence officer. She was an ordinary woman who lived an ordinary life. And yet her actions became part of the larger global story of the Cold War. And perhaps that is what makes her story so memorable. It reminds us that history is not shaped only by world leaders or major global events. Sometimes it is shaped by the quiet decisions of individuals whose actions may seem small at the time. But years, or even decades later, those actions can become part of a much bigger picture in world history. If you found this story interesting and want to learn more about hidden stories from the Cold War and real historical espionage cases, make sure to subscribe to the channel and stay tuned for the next video.